Good morning or good afternoon to everyone, wherever you are across this country. Thank you for joining us. My name is David Evans. I'm a professor at the University of Alberta, and I've been asked to talk a little bit about a topic called how and why to communicate with decision makers. Before I get started, I just want to thank the organizers of the meeting, particularly Erin Love, who I know has put a tremendous amount of effort into making these presentations possible under what are very difficult circumstances. So thank you to everyone. My name is Dave Evans. Like I said, I'm a professor. I guess the reason I was asked to give this talk, and I gave a very similar talk to this group a couple of years ago as well, is that I've held a number of administrative positions over the course of my career. I was a department chair for about 15 years in two universities, University of Guelph and University of Alberta. And I was also a vice dean for research for 5 years here at the University of Alberta. So that's given me some sort of perspective on both the decision makers beyond me, and then of course I've been approached in many capacities by people who wanted to or had problems that needed to be addressed. So I guess what I'm saying is this really comes from personal experience in managing these kind of questions. So this is the outline of what I plan to talk about today. I'll start by actually just explaining who I think of as when I think about decision makers. I'll call it DMs. And we'll go through some very practical issues like why would you want to talk to sort of senior leadership, that kind of thing. What's the best approach? What should you do? When should you do it? And also some very practical insights into some do's and don'ts that if I think you follow them, you'll be more effective in these communications. With a bit of time permitting at the end of the talk, I'll give a few examples and then we'll switch to a live feed, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. All right, so who are these decision makers? Well, broadly speaking, these are the people whose activities affect your academic world. And they can be all kinds of people, and most commonly, they would just be your daily contacts. They're the people that are your supervisors. There are your lab and administrative staff, and they're the peers now and someday. I say now and someday because I think people often forget that the people that you know, hang out with nowadays in 5-10 years, maybe someone who's making decisions about your life. And I have some advice on that. And I also want to stress that your family is always an important decision maker that you have to keep in mind when you're thinking about approaching them. A very common one, of course, is the university administration. These are people like the research services office. And also the obvious people are your chairs, the vice deans, deans, and presidents who run the place around you. They may have different titles, but broadly speaking, that's the people you would be approaching quite commonly. Another one, of course, if you're reaching a stage where you're applying for grants, are the funding agencies who make decisions about those grants. And buried within that structure are people like the panel members on grant panels, the people who chair panels at CIHR, and the administration, the people that take care of delivering the money and receiving your grants. Some of the people in the audience may also be dealing with scientific journals, trying to get papers published. And of course, you'll run across editors and reviewers when you do that as well. And then there's a couple of areas that probably most people in the audience aren't yet approaching, but at some point you will. These are people who run the government of Canada or the province you live in. There are the administrators, of course, who deliver on some of these projects, your funding. And then, of course, there are the elected officials who make, at the ultimate end, decisions about research, funding, and practice. And then the other one, of course, is the public. The public have a say as well in how you get your research done. Of course, they make decisions about funding for research, ultimately by voting for or against certain political parties. In practice, it's often the press who represents that. And some of you may have already run into interactions with the press, and I'll talk about that some more as well. So there could be many reasons why you might want to contact a decision maker. A common one is you've got a problem and you need some help or advice. If you're writing grants or trying to get the approvals for your grant to be spent, you'll need ethics approval. You need a grant to get signed in order for it to be sent off. And a very common one in this world of university bureaucracies growing bigger and bigger every year is you simply can't figure out who you're supposed to talk to, who is the bureaucrat that makes some decisions for you. Another one is that you may want to provide some advice, offer help, or report something. Perhaps you've got some ideas about a better way to do something. Maybe you've got a really great discovery or paper or invention that you'd like to tell the world about, a very valuable thing to be doing. And then, of course, there's always the issues of ethics. You may have observed something which, broadly speaking, is an ethical issue. And we do have an obligation to report those, but when you're doing that, you have to tread very carefully, and I'll talk about some of that later. A very common one in academia is you want to complain. Everyone likes to complain, and sometimes that can be helpful, getting it off your chest, talking to someone else. Very common things are that your grant or your paper wasn't accepted or funded. Again, there's too much paperwork, you're being driven crazy. And then finally, I generally fit this into the category of nobody loves you. And then the final one that I think is all too often forgotten is thank you. You got a grant or a scholarship. It could be worth a very large amount of money. It's not a bad idea to contact some decision makers and say thank you for that, because I think in future it will help to keep the research funding going forward. And it's just good manners. So what's the best approach for approaching decision makers? Let's consider all the different issues. I'm going to start with managing a problem where you need advice. All right. I always tell people, before you start, do some homework. Figure out what the problem is and where it actually lies. See if you could possibly solve it yourself without, going forward to talk to someone else. And I'm going to stress this. You need to ask yourself whether you are the problem. Okay, and that's where this cartoon of Pogo, a very old cartoon, we've met the enemy and he is us. In my personal experience, very frequently, some of the biggest complainers are actually the cause of their own problems. So ask yourself, are you the problem? For example, there's a very simple one. Have you read the instructions? I know I'm guilty of that. I don't want to be bothered. I just press buttons and it doesn't work. That's probably not the best thing. There's lots of instructions out there. Go and make an effort to figure out what it is. The second one is figure out who the right person to approach is. There's people called subject matter experts. They will often know the answer, and the trick is to figure out who they are. They may not be who you think they are. Sometimes a senior administrative person in your office may know a lot more about it than your chair would ever know. If you have a problem with budgets and financing, for example, go look for the right person. And also, if it is something that has to be fixed, make sure that person is the right person who can do something. Again, going to the wrong person, they may sympathize, may have to offer some advice, but they may not be able to help. So do a little bit of homework and figure out who the right person is. Another one that's really important is match the problem to the decision maker's job or status, okay? The dean might be a really important person who can make lots of things happen, but he or she can't be bothered with dealing with your the fact that something's broken in your office. You need to sort of make some decisions about, is this worth their attention, that they'll spend some time helping me figure it out. And then on a related note, it's be respectful of that decision maker's time and operating constraints. Again, often the more critical issues that you may need to take up the chain of command are going to be brought to the attention of very, very busy people. So be respectful of that. Schedule a meeting, give them some background documents and advice. Don't just show up on the door and say, here's the issue, and leave those people time to do it. Be very sensitive also to external rules and regulations. You may not like the bureaucracy that the animal utilization protocol requires you to fill out all these numbers and things, but that's not the fault of your animal care committee. That is the rules set by the Canadian Council on Animal Care. They're simply managing them, and they have to, because if those rules aren't followed, the university where you're working can lose its funding. So, you may not like it, but be careful to be sure you know what the regulations are. And then finally, as some advice I'd give people is listen to that advice. All too often, you have people come in, they complain, you try and help them, and then they just don't do anything about it. They don't listen, and that's just disrespectful and wasteful of people's time. Continuing this topic, what's the best approach? You want to provide advice, offer help, or report something. So again, a starting point is to figure out the right person and/or pathway. So for example, you want to talk about research news, well, in most places there's an institutional press office. Our faculty has its own press office, but they're connected to the university press office as well. Most places have research services or operations. They're the people that take care of finances, grant operations, and you need to sort of figure out how that works in your own particular institution. Another thing to remember is advice is always welcome, and what I advise people to do there is be very practical, first of all. So you'll get people coming into your office and they'll say, you know, Dr. Evans, we really need this, that, or the other done. But if you sort of explain to them, that's a really good idea, but the cost of it would be, we estimate this amount. If it's millions and millions of dollars, most institutions just don't have it. So do some math in advance of any suggestions that might involve money or time and labor. And this relates to the second point, is to be willing to help deliver on your advice, all right? Very commonly over the years as a chair, I had people come into my office and say, I think this would be a fantastic course. We need this one. My standard reply to that is that it's almost always a really good idea. And I'll say that, thank you, that's a really good idea. Are you willing to lead the charge on creating that course and teaching it? And you'd be surprised how many people think it's their colleague's job to deliver the teaching. They just want to deliver on the idea. So be prepared to help. That makes a huge difference. And it really will stand you in good stead if you are willing to stand behind your advice and help. A common one, of course, is equipment. We need this piece of equipment. Are you willing to help write a CFI grant to get that money? And then the last one on this slide is take care with your reporting, especially on things around ethical breaches. This is a landmine, and you really want to watch yourself. It's very important. All of us are responsible within our institutions to report on safety violations, animal ethics violations, human ethics violations. You do have an obligation to do that. But this is not the kind of thing to report a rumor that you heard third hand from someone. Make sure that you really are on secure foundations before you bring this to the attention of a decision maker. And in that regard, the whole issue of confidentiality is absolutely essential. You shouldn't use email. It's best, if you want to bring this to the attention of a decision maker, say, I would like to talk about something, but I don't want to use email. Can we talk on the phone or meet with that person? That will give you a chance to speak freely without having to worry too much about liability and lawyers, and get a sense of whether you're on the right track. Don't send emails that could be called upon to haunt you later. And in this regard, it's also very important to choose your DM carefully, okay? It relates to the seriousness of the matter. If it's a really major concern of animal ethics, human ethics, for example, I would strongly recommend you approach senior leadership first, for example, a vice dean of research, and bounce it off them. Those individuals have had some experience with dealing with this and can give you good advice on where to manage this. They may say, well, that's not really that critical, and they'll help you circle back to maybe your chair or your PI. This is the case where being careful in choosing a senior DM is probably the best advice I can give you about this. People can get in very serious troubles, and I'm sure you've all seen the press reports from different universities where people have got in a mess over ethical issues. What's the best approach if you want to simply complain? Well, a common thing is just identify the person who can do something about it. Otherwise, it'll just make me feel good to complain to your colleagues, and there's nothing wrong with that, but it isn't going to help you in any way. Next one is to work your way up the ladder of responsibilities. I think, particularly for junior people, you may not be aware of a very common practice amongst decision makers is that we always try to respect the decisions of the people who report to them, all right? So if you have a complaint, this is a case where you really should go to the junior decision maker first and see what it is they can do to help you. So if it's a research office kind of thing, talk to the staff person that is responsible for the document that you're dealing with or the issue you're dealing with. Give them a chance first to help you and explain what's going on. The reason why that is important is that a senior DM will not typically second guess the decisions of junior people, the people who report to them. It's very bad management practice, unless there's a real problem. And it's just polite. If someone may have made a mistake with your documents, your grants, approach them first and just try to figure out what the thing is. Don't just go right over their heads. That it never works out well that way. A third one is to make sure you know all the facts. Do a little bit of homework. Figure out the problem. And this is, again, are you sure it isn't really you that's causing it? Try to keep a bit of a distance from it. Don't make a mountain out of a molehill. Sometimes it's better to go, yeah, okay, well, that's just the way it is, and just walk away from it. Because I've seen people who've got a reputation of becoming complainers, and it, in the long run, doesn't help them in an institution. And then, of course, it's also really helpful if you can come up with solutions. It's fine to go in there and say, this is all screwed up and I don't like it. What are you going to do about it? Come up with a suggestion. Well, this is what I think could be done to help fix this. And everyone will appreciate that. Maybe it won't work, but at least it's a starting point. With respect to grants and papers, of course, an unfunded grant in practice, that's the way our world works right now. Only about 15% of CIHR grants get funded. The first thing to be aware of is that the reviewers of the grants and panel chairs are subject to confidentiality. If you sat on this panel, you'll be well aware that you sign documents or you check boxes on documents that you're going to follow Canadian federal confidentiality rules. They can't tell you what's going on. The documents you get from the panels are only documents you can really get. Don't approach them. It puts people in a difficult position. Money is tight and not every grant can get funded. There are other ways of dealing with unfunded grants. And papers is another one. In my experience, arguing with editors just generally doesn't work. Sometimes if you can document a really egregious error by a reviewer, that'll be important and helpful. So do that. But often editors are resistant to ignoring the advice of their reviewers. They've been picked for good reasons. But it can be done, but you have to have a good argument to go somewhere there. And then finally, be prepared to compromise. You can't have it all your way just because you don't like it. Sometimes there are lots of reasons why something happened. You got to kind of figure out what's the best way forward that will keep everyone reasonably happy. This best approach, let's say you want to say thank you. And I pulled this little sketch out of the internet at some point. It's over, 75 years since we sent troops into the World War I into Netherlands. Canadian troops did that. If you go to Ottawa in the spring, you'll still see the flowers and bulbs that they send to Ottawa every year for thank you. It's a really important thing to be doing. It's very much appreciated, and it's also politically smart. I have routinely over the years, when someone in the university, no matter who they are, junior, senior, whatever, has done something really well or been helpful, I will make an effort to send an email or a message to them and their senior management saying thank you for doing such a good job. This is important actually, because this is part of their career. Those people will get promoted for that reason. And don't you want to see the best people in the research office promoted? So make an effort just to say thank you. It's remarkable how much it helps. It may also be one way of generating more money for research, but not too fine a point on it. The way to do it, there's lots of different ways. If it's something that you really think is worthy of attention, write a formal letter to many of the people in the chain of that person's command. So typically, if someone in the research services office did a really nice job of helping you under short, stressful circumstances, write a letter to the Vice Dean Research and say thank you, and then CC the individual who did that. You'd be amazed at how people are grateful. A lot of the people in our universities get all kinds of criticism. They're constantly inundated with criticism, but they very rarely get thank yous, and it'll stand you in very good stead. Again, you have to kind of judge what the target of the letter would be by the activity. So let's say your supervisor helped you get a scholarship, and they did a great job helping it and review it. Write the chair and dean and say thank you for so-and-so. They did a great job. If someone, as I just mentioned earlier, if someone in an office staff person did a good job, write their 1/1, the vice president or vice dean for research. And then an important one, again, and this is all too often forgotten, you get something like a CIHR grant or a Banting scholarship. Will it really kill you to write a letter to your MP or Minister of Health to get it for saying thank you for that? It shows that their money is being useful, and you can sort of say something to them about, well, with this, I'm going to do this, X, Y, and Z. It just keeps things like CIHR in the attention of your member of parliament. You can go visit them too. I mean, I went to see my MP just recently. His office actually is right next to my dentist. So I made an appointment to go see him. We spent a nice 30 minutes just chatting about stuff. I said, I'm not here to complain or ask for money. I just want to say thank you for the CHR. And I think this is always going to be helpful in the very long run. So when should you contact a DM? Well, there isn't any simple answer to this. You know, you have to judge it by the circumstances. You have to figure out whether it's really necessary and figure out who it is by the importance of the issue. I would suggest, again, exhaust other avenues first. Like I say, read the instructions, talk to your peers. They maybe have the answer. And also, if there are channels for appeal, use it if possible. Don't just go out on your own. Just take a look at, well, I don't like this and who do I complain to? And again, a thank you is always welcome. So some do's and don'ts. I've kind of implied this all along, but here's a few things. Try to match the issue to the DM's place in the hierarchy. Obviously, people have certain responsibilities and your issue should fall within those. Approach them in a respectful and informed manner. They're often very busy people and they don't have time to be wasted. You also have to be aware that very senior decision makers, presidents, deputy ministers, and so on, they really have to limit their accessibility and they spend most of their time talking to their peers. You can approach them by writing letters, or you can work with your own DMs to approach them. This is really quite important. Many of these senior people won't talk to anyone but their peers. So you would need to actually talk to one of your DMs who can approach them in a peer-to-peer basis if it's a really critical issue. Be prepared to offer practical solutions and be nice to people who make your work possible. Don't be rude to particularly the junior staff that help make sure all your grants have the T's crossed and I's dotted. Don't bypass the processes and the command chain. With the one exception I talked about with ethical issues, then you probably need to step a little higher up the chain. Don't whinge and whine. It just gets really tiring to hear that all the time. As the saying goes, you get a dog if you want unconditional love. And like I said, don't ignore the people around you. That includes your family and peers. They're very important in regulating your life, really. I mean, decisions that you want to make need to be reviewed by your family and your peers. Just a few other bits of random advice. People will sometimes go over other people's heads because they're really pissed off, okay? Be careful if you're going to do this. You will certainly annoy the person that you've bypassed, and you're going to be meeting them again at some point. And as I stressed earlier, his or her boss will not generally second guess the decisions of junior deputy decision makers. That's very bad practice, unless there's a really good cause. Try and exhaust the proper channels before you go higher up. And the same rules are true if you want to go outside of your institution. This is an area where you really need to be very careful. So for example, if I were to sort of call up the government of Alberta, for whatever reason I was able to talk to a deputy minister or whatever, I'm required to report that to the government, that meeting with the government, to University of Alberta administration, because there's a lot of very sensitive rules about lobbying, for example, that we have to watch out for. So do watch yourself on that one. Also, institutions in general don't like problems exposed to the outside world. So if you can try to solve it within your world, that's better. The press loves it if they can see everyone squabbling and put it in their reports, but it's not really good for the university or institution where you work. Also, if you're going to do this, governments also like to see people squabbling over money and proposing all kinds of different ways to spend it. It's a great excuse for not doing anything. If you really must talk to a minister, you better make sure that you're in alignment with what your institutional policies are. Otherwise, you're going to just make a mess of everything. And then also remind you that the press aren't your friend. They've got their own agenda, so don't necessarily trust them. A lot of institutions have sort of courses or brief courses about how to interact with the press. And if you think you're likely to ever do that, I would strongly recommend that you attend one of them. And your press office can provide you advice on that. Just the last few things, I think we've got a bit of time left. A few examples. So one of the things you can often do is include a polite CC on emails or stuff like that. If someone offers to help, you can always say, thank you, and I look forward to your assistance on this matter, right? A few years ago, the anti-vax topic came up in Montreal. It was led by Juliette Guichon, who's a professor at the University of Calgary. She's a tremendous defender of the value of vaccine work. When there was some reports in the Montreal press about one particular group was proposing that there were dangers to vaccines, she led the charge and very effectively, I think, contained it. That involved going to the press and bringing a whole bunch of people along with her as signatures to the letter that she wrote. And it was a very effective approach to trying to shut down some of this really destructive anti-vaccine opinions that are sort of circulating out there in the internet and the wild. I think the thing to remember about this and what Juliet did is the question of, well, who do you represent? You can't just go and claim I'm representing all vaccine researchers in the country. But Juliet was smart. She knew a lot of us, and she got a whole slew of people who were immunologists and virologists and vaccine researchers to sign the letter with her, and it gave her much more credibility in approaching the press about the article they wrote. Another example was some work that was done by Jim Woodgett, who's down here. Jim led the charge at really attacking the complete mess that CIHR had made of restructuring the way they delivered grants. This was just bungled from A to Z. And he was forced to do this. And it wasn't like CIHR wouldn't listen. Academics like myself had complained internally to all kinds of administrative staff and the then president of CIHR that this was just not going to work. And the experience we had trying to deliver grants with the system that CIHR set up showed that it was a complete mess. And so Jim took it on himself. He's a very well respected senior investigator in Toronto. He took it on himself to lead the charge of a bunch of university academics to say, look, you have to stop this. And he took it all the way to government, to the press. And it finally, because it was so high profile, it made some real changes at CIHR. And essentially CIHR, the CIHR went back to the older system they had with some modifications, but it put things back on a regular plane. It was too much too far, and Jim did it the right way. This is a case where one really has to identify the right decision maker and be very careful of the libel laws. So the last thing I'll just mention to you, and I sort of alluded to this earlier in the talk, is thinking about the decision makers that you encounter. There's an old saying which supposedly is accredited to this gentleman who I frankly had never heard of, to be quite honest, but Wikipedia said it was, so it has to be right. Be nice to people on your way up because you'll meet the same people on the way down. So that's really good advice. Particularly for junior people, you're working in an environment where there's all kinds of people around you. Being a jerk, getting angry at people, complaining, whinging, whining, those people have memories, and some of them may end up in positions of authority that you may not be happy having to deal with. It's the same sort of thing on the internet. Be careful what pictures you post nowadays, but this is sort of an older idea. So I would recommend that you always be very careful with dealing with the people around you, because at some point you may well rely on them to help you when the time comes. I've pretty much finished. Acknowledge the people that have helped me with my research over the years, in particular Tri-Council. CFI has been very generous with their equipment funding. And we have a number of research contracts as well from the private and public sector. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.